Solitary Pop here. Today we're going to take a look at a full-on Bleeds build of Assassination Rogue. I stacked every talent, setup choice, and rotation around maximizing bleed damage, and it hits a lot harder than I expected. How hard? Well, once someone gets caught in the combo, you can basically sit back and watch them desperately try everything they can to stay alive while their health slowly drains away. It's almost entertaining to watch them struggle as the bleeds finish the job. This build is similar in some ways to my last Envenom focused burst build, but the overall goal is completely different. Instead of stacking every possible damage modifier to create the biggest Envenom imaginable, this build pulls in every talent that enhances bleeds and focuses on maximizing damage over time effects. And I will make a bold claim. If you follow this guide all the way through, pretty much anyone can pick up and play this build successfully. It's surprisingly straightforward once you understand the core mechanics. For the hero talent, we are going with Deathstalker. Now just to be clear, the current meta is definitely leaning toward Fatebound, but there are two main reasons I'm choosing Deathstalker for this build. The first reason is Corrupt the Blood. This talent increases the damage of Rupture by 20%, which is a huge deal for a Bleeds build. And it gets even better because it directly synergizes with a couple of Assassination talents we are already taking. You've got Bloody Mess, which increases Rupture damage by 15%, and Avulsion, which increases Rupture damage by another 20%. All of these talents work together to amplify your overall bleed pressure. The reason I'm starting with Rupture is simple. Out of all the bleeds effects in this build, Rupture ends up contributing the largest share of your bleed damage. So if you're talking about maximizing bleed damage, this is really the foundation of the entire setup. Today's sponsor is Player Auctions. If you're looking for help with your in-game progress in WoW, Player Auctions is a marketplace platform worth checking out. It's completely player to player, and because the player has been around for a long time, there's a very large and established network of both buyers and sellers. For concern people often have with such marketplaces, that's where their player guardian system comes in. The seller doesn't get paid until the buyer confirms everything has been delivered properly, which adds an extra layer of security to the transaction progress. So if you'd like to check it out, you can use the link in the description below or simply search Player Auctions WoW on Google. Next up is Unshakable Drive. This talent activates whenever you consume Deathstalker's Mark, increasing the damage of your next Mutilate by 50%. Now some of you might be thinking, wait a second, Mutilate isn't a bleed ability. And you are absolutely right. By itself, Mutilate deals physical damage, which is honestly one of the weakest damage types in WoW, because it's heavily affected by your opponent's armor. But that's where Doomsblade comes in. With Doomsblade, 25 of your Mutilate damage gets converted into bleed effect over 8 seconds. And unlike many effects in the game, this bleed can continuously stack. So even though Mutilate isn't technically a bleed ability, that's why Mutilate scaling is actually very important for this build. On top of that, we also take Systematic Failure, which increases Mutilate damage by another 30%. One thing worth mentioning is that I don't use Ambush at all in this build. Ambush is also physical damage, and more importantly, it doesn't really have meaningful synergy with our bleed focused setup. So even when you're stealth, your filler isn't Ambush, it's still Mutilate. I could even tell you to remove Ambush from your keybinds entirely for this build, because you won't be using it. As for the talents that buff Garrot, most Assassination Rogue players already know them, so I'll keep this part brief. Talents like Improved Garrot, Bloody Mess, and Shrouded Suffocation provide a huge amount of additional damage and are some of the core pieces of any bleed focused setup. One important difference with this build is that we don't take Dragon Tempered Blades, which means we are limited to only 2 poisons instead of 4. Because of that, we'll invest a few extra talent points into Wound Poison and Crippling Poison to get the most value out of them. Personally, I think the placement of Amplifying Poison in the talent tree is pretty unfortunate. In this build, it's basically a wasted talent. Maybe it's a different story in PvE, but in PvP, it's really hard to justify giving up Wound Poison because the healing reduction is simply too important. Next, we take the Apex talent Implacable, which gives us another 20% increase to overall bleed damage. The last 2 talents I want to talk about is Zodiac Recipe and Sudden Demise. First, they provide a passive increase to your bleed damage, but the real reason we are taking them is what happens when the target drops below 35% health. Once that happens, your bleed effects deal 30% additional damage, which is already incredibly strong. But the really scary part is sudden demise. If the remaining bleed damage on the target exceeds 150% of their remaining health, they simply die. No healing, no recovery, no last second comeback, they just fall over. And the reason this talent is so good in Battlegrounds is that fights are constantly breaking out all over the map. There are always low health targets running around, which means both talents ends up triggering far more often than you expect.
First blood.
We also pick up internal bleeding, which causes kidney shot and rupture to deal additional bleed damage. Now, the damage from any single application isn't going to look particularly impressive, but the thing is, kidney shot and rupture are abilities you are using constantly throughout the match. And on top of that, we have taken virtually every talent available that increases overall bleed damage, so when all of these bleed effects start stacking together, damage really adds up. And this brings me to the most important part of the build. The core idea here is to focus on pure bleed damage, not poisons. We are not investing heavily into Envenom talents, so you shouldn't expect Envenom to hit particularly hard. In fact, I wouldn't even think of Envenom as a damage button in this build. Instead, its main purpose is to activate effects like Dashing Scoundrel and Implacable, helping with energy generation and keeping the rest of your bleed-based engine running smoothly. The exact rotation will vary depending on the battleground and the situation, but the general idea is pretty straightforward. Start from stealth with an empowered Garrote, then apply Rupture. After that, use Crimson Tempest to spread your bleed pressure and activate Scent of Blood, giving yourself additional agility. Once you have established your bleeds and identified the kill target, start using Envenom a few times and then commit Kingsbane. Ideally, this forces the enemy to trade defensive cooldowns, but even if they don't, you still gain a substantial amount of free haste through Regicid's reward, so there's value either way. One important difference from the Envenom burst build I covered previously is that you should not think of Deathmark and Kingsbane as a package deal. In the Envenom build, those cooldowns were almost always paired together to create one massive burst window. In this bleed build, that's no longer the case. You use Kingsbane as a bait and finish off the weakened target with Deathmark. Anyway, if you have managed to force out the enemy's defensive cooldown through that process, the game is basically over. The moment those defensives expire, re-enter stealth, apply another empowered Garrote and Rupture, and then hit them with Deathmark. Not only are they now taking duplicated bleed effects from Deathmark, but once they drop below 35% health, Zolde Recipe kicks in and increases your bleed damage by another 30%. And if their health falls even lower, 10% or less in PvP, Sudden Demise kicks in and instantly kills the target. One thing to keep in mind is that this build focuses on Deathstalker's Mark, not Darkest Night. More specifically, we are not really interested in the mark itself. What we are trying to maximize is Unshakable Drive, the buff that activates when you consume Deathstalker's Mark and empowers your next Mutilate. Because of that, your opener is typically Garrote Mutilate, not Garrote. The objective is to fit in as many buffed Mutilates as possible, since those Mutilates are feeding into Doomblade, benefiting from Unshakable Drive, and ultimately contributing a significant portion of your bleed damage. In short, use your finishing moves with at least 5 combo points at all times. The secondary stat priority is pretty simple. We are going to stack as much Mastery as possible, since Mastery directly increases our bleed damage. As for crit and haste, we are not going to prioritize them nearly as much on our gear. Instead, we will make up for a lot of those stats through talents and temporary buffs, especially talents like Regicid's reward coming from Kingsbane. One of the biggest strengths of this build is that once you have finished your combo, you don't have to spend the next 30 seconds chasing the target around the map. At that point, their fate is already sealed. And that's why the build performs surprisingly well against classes that are normally difficult for rogues to stick to, such as Hunters, Evokers, and Demon Hunters. Even if they create distance, your damage keeps working. The main weakness is that the build really starts to shine once the target drops below 35% health. Getting them to that threshold can sometimes take a while, especially against healthy targets with plenty of defensives available. But battlegrounds are not usually about isolated 1v1s. There's combat happening everywhere. So instead of thinking about this build as a dueling build, it's often better to think of yourself as an executioner. Look for weakened targets, apply your bleeds, and finish the job. That's where the build is at its strongest. And that's it for today's build.